The fire crackles between us, casting dancing shadows across my grandson's face. Tyler sits across from me, 19 years old, his smartphone dark and silent in his pocket for the first time in months. The night air carries the scent of pine and wood smoke, and above us the Oregon sky spreads out in a blanket of stars so thick you could read by them. He asked me a question tonight. The same question his grandmother asked every few months. The same question my daughter Emma stopped asking years ago, because she already knows the answer. Why do I live here hidden in these woods, in a house that disappears into the hillside like a secret? Why not move to town, live in comfort, spend my final years the way normal people do? I told him I'd answer, but only if he was willing to hear the whole truth. Not the sanitized version, not the highlights. The real story with all its weight and all its pain. He nodded, settled himself by the fire, and waited. So let me tell you about 1983, Tyler. Let me tell you about the year I turned 19, just like you are now. The year I stood before a choice that would define everything I would become. It started with a door closing. October 15th, 1983, Portland, Oregon. I remember the date because it was my birthday, though no one at Northview Boys' Home marked it with any particular ceremony. At exactly 9 in the morning, I walked through the front entrance for the last time, a battered military surplus duffel bag slung over my shoulder. Everything I owned packed inside. The air was cold that morning, sharp with the promise of an early winter. Leaves covered the cracked sidewalk in drifts of red and gold, and the sky hung low and gray above the city. I wore Levi's jeans that were slightly too short, a flannel shirt I'd owned for 3 years, and Converse sneakers with holes forming at the toes. In my pocket, a Sony Walkman played Bruce Springsteen's Born in the USA on a cassette tape I'd bought used for $2. The irony of that song on that particular morning wasn't lost on me even then. I was 19, not 18. Most kids aged out of the system at 18, but I'd earned myself an extra year through what they politely called behavioral issues. The truth was simpler. A 15-year-old named Danny had been getting beaten regularly by an older boy, and I'd put a stop to it the only way that seemed effective at the time. The state decided I needed another year of supervision before they trusted me with freedom. Standing on those steps, I felt the weight of 13 years pressing down on me. Not 12, 13, because I'd entered the system at 6 years old and the math was important. Let me tell you about that day, Tyler, the day that made me an orphan. It was 1970 and I was 6 years old. My father drove a Ford Pinto baby blue with a crack in the windshield he kept meaning to fix. We were driving east on Highway 26, heading home from a visit to my mother's sister in the valley. I sat in the back seat playing with a toy soldier, making engine noises with my mouth. I don't remember the truck that crossed the center line. I don't remember the impact. What I remember is waking up in a hospital bed, every part of me hurting, and seeing an old man sitting beside me. He had white hair and deep lines around his eyes, and his hands trembled slightly as they rested on his knees. He wore a simple button-down shirt and work pants, and something about the set of his shoulders suggested military bearing even in his age. Thomas Ross, my grandfather. A man I'd met maybe twice in my short life. His voice was rough like gravel, shifting. Son, your parents didn't make it. The accident, it took them both. Your daddy, he was my boy, and he made some mistakes, but he loved you more than anything. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, Ethan. Then he did something that confused my 6-year-old mind. He stood up, kissed my forehead, and walked out of the room. I called after him, but he didn't come back. 2 days later, a social worker arrived with paperwork, and I learned that Thomas Ross had signed away his parental rights. The state would be my guardian now. For 13 years, I believed he'd abandoned me, that he'd looked at his orphaned grandson and decided the burden was too much. I carried that belief like a stone in my chest, growing heavier with each birthday that passed without a card, each Christmas morning that brought no gift, each parent's visiting day when I sat alone while other boys met with family. Northview wasn't cruel exactly. It was institutional. Beige walls and fluorescent lights and the smell of industrial cleaner that never quite masked the underlying odor of too many boys living in too small a space. The food was adequate. The beds were hard. The rules were clear and consistently enforced. We had school during the day, chores in the evening, lights out at 9. What we didn't have was anyone who knew our names mattered. But there was one man who made a difference. Mr. Peterson, the home's maintenance supervisor and woodshop teacher. He was maybe 60, built like a fire hydrant, with scarred knuckles and a crew cut gone white. He'd been a Marine, served 2 tours in Korea, and he ran the wood shop like a drill sergeant ran a platoon. He taught me to work with my hands, how to measure twice and cut once, how to read the grain of wood, how to understand that a well-made joint was stronger than any nail or screw. He never asked about my past or offered sympathy for my situation. He just put tools in my hands and expected excellence. A man is measured by what he builds. Ross, he'd say, watching me struggle with the mortise and tenon joint. Not by what he says, not by what he promises, by what he leaves behind when he's gone. I didn't understand it then, but those words would echo through my life. So there I stood on October 15th, 1983, with my duffel bag and my Walkman, and exactly $23.47 to my name. The social worker had given me an address downtown. A lawyer's office told me there was one final piece of business to conclude regarding my grandfather's estate. A formality, she said. Just sign some papers and you'll be free and clear. I walked the 2 miles because I didn't have bus fare to spare. The city felt alien after 13 years of institutional life. Too loud, too fast, too full of people who moved with purpose while I drifted like smoke. I kept my head down and my hands in my pockets and tried not to look as lost as I felt. The building was glass and steel, 14 floors of professional quiet. The elevator was mirrored and I caught sight of myself as it rose. Thin face, hollow eyes that looked older than 19. I needed a haircut. I needed about 100 things I couldn't afford. The law office of Henderson and Associates occupied the entire 14th floor. The receptionist barely glanced up when I gave my name, just pointed toward a door marked Conference Room B. I found Robert Henderson waiting inside. He was maybe 60, with thinning gray hair and wire-rimmed glasses that kept sliding down his nose. He wore a tweed suit that had seen better days and a tie with a coffee stain near the bottom. His office smelled of old paper and stale coffee, and the walls were decorated with the kind of abstract art that looked like someone had sneezed paint onto canvas. "Mr. Ross," he said, gesturing to a chair. "Ethan, happy birthday." The greeting surprised me. I sat down slowly. He slid a cardboard box across the mahogany desk. It was maybe a foot square, sealed with yellowed packing tape that looked decades old. "Your grandfather, Thomas Ross, passed away in 1976, 7 years ago. He left explicit instructions that this box be held in trust until your 19th birthday." I stared at the box, not touching it. "I was told there was nothing." Henderson folded his hands. "Financially, that's accurate. Your grandfather spent what little he had on arrangements after your parents died, and then on legal fees. What's in this box is your entire inheritance." He paused, his expression shifting to something that might have been sympathy. "And it's complicated." I pulled the box toward me and broke the tape with my thumbnail. Inside, nested in old newspaper, I found 4 things: a heavy iron key dark with age, a thick manila envelope stuffed with papers, a smaller sealed envelope with my name written in shaky handwriting across the front, and something that made my breath catch in my throat. 2 military medals mounted on faded ribbon, a Bronze Star and a Purple Heart. Henderson cleared his throat. "Your grandfather was a Korean War veteran, Marine Corps. He fought at the Chosin Reservoir in 1950. He paused. "One of the worst battles of that war. Minus 35 degrees, surrounded by Chinese forces. Most men who were there don't talk about it." I picked up the medals with trembling fingers. I'd never known Thomas had served, never known anything about him except that he'd given me up. "The large envelope contains a property deed," Henderson continued. 5 acres in the Cascade foothills, about 3 hours east of here. There's a structure on the property, something called a Quonset hut, a military surplus building, steel frame, corrugated metal. He bought the land in 1955 with his VA benefits. He slid another paper across the desk. "A tax bill. But there's a problem. Property taxes are 2 years delinquent. You have 90 days to pay $4,200, or the county will seize the land and auction it." I looked at the number and felt something hollow open in my chest. I had $23. "There's one more thing," Henderson said quietly. He gestured to a folder I hadn't noticed. "I've been contacted by a man named Marcus Harlow. His family has, shall we say, a long-standing interest in your grandfather's property. They're offering $85,000 cash for the land." The number was so absurd I almost laughed. 85,000. Henderson nodded. "It's a generous offer, Ethan. More than generous. With that money, you could go to college, buy a car, get an apartment, start a real life. He leaned forward, his voice gentle. I've handled estates for 40 years, and I've seen a lot of young people in your position. The smart ones take the money. The ones who try to hold on to land they can't afford, they end up with nothing. What's the catch? I asked. Henderson hesitated. The Harlow family, they're not people you want as enemies. Marcus's father, Victor, he had a reputation, loan sharking, intimidation, that sort of thing. He died recently, cancer, but Marcus is cut from the same cloth. Maybe worse because he's educated. MBA expensive suits, but just as ruthless. He pushed the contact information across the desk. I'm telling you this as someone who doesn't want to see you get hurt. Sell the land, take the money, don't look back. I scooped everything into my duffel bag. The key felt cold and heavy in my palm, like it weighed more than iron should. I stood to leave. Henderson called after me. Ethan, your grandfather left one more instruction. The small envelope, the personal letter. He was very specific. You're only supposed to read it after you understand the full situation, after you know about the taxes and the offer. I looked down at the envelope in my hand. Why? Henderson shook his head. He didn't say. But knowing Thomas, he had his reasons. I walked out into the October afternoon and kept walking until I found myself at the Greyhound station. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and the plastic seats were hard and cold. I bought a cup of coffee I couldn't afford and sat in a corner, the small envelope burning like a coal in my pocket. Around me, the station hummed with transit and transition. A mother tried to quiet a crying baby. An old man dozed with his hat pulled low. Near the vending machines, 3 men in their 50s sat in a loose circle, passing a flask and talking in the shorthand of shared experience. Veterans, I realized. Their conversation drifted over. You remember Jackson built himself a place out in the gorge. Nothing fancy, just a cabin. Works with his hands now. Says it's the only thing that keeps the nightmares quiet. Man needs something he built himself. Something that's his. War teaches you that. Everything they give you, they can take away. But what you make with your own hands, that's yours forever. I sat there in that bus station until the sky went dark. My hand wrapped around the envelope, and finally I broke the seal. The letter was 8 pages, handwritten in careful block letters that showed the tremor of an old man's hand, but also military precision. Each word was deliberate, placed with the care of someone who knew this might be his last communication with the world. The first line stopped my heart. Ethan, if you're reading this, I'm gone and you're a man now. I need to tell you about Korea. November 1950, I was 23 years old, a private first class in the 1st Marine Division. We were stationed at the Chosin Reservoir, a frozen hellscape in the mountains of North Korea. The Chinese had surrounded us, 30,000 Marines cut off from support temperatures, dropping to minus 35 Fahrenheit. We dug foxholes in ground frozen harder than concrete. We ate sea rations that had turned to ice. We slept in shifts if we slept at all, because to sleep too long in that cold meant you didn't wake up. I watched boys barely older than you are now lose fingers and toes to frostbite. I watched men die not from bullets, but from the cold itself, their bodies simply giving up. We survived because of one thing. We dug in. When you can't run, when retreat means death, you dig deep into the earth. You make the ground itself your armor. The earth protected us when nothing else could. I came home from that war with these medals you're holding. The Bronze Star for valor, the Purple Heart for getting shot in the leg during the retreat. But I also came home with a lesson burned into my bones. The earth will protect you if you work with it, if you make it your ally instead of your enemy. I put down the letter, my hands shaking. Around me, the bus station continued its quiet chaos, but I was somewhere else. Somewhere cold and terrible, watching a young man who would become my grandfather learn to survive. I kept reading. I came back to the States in '51, got a job as a railroad engineer, saved my money, bought 5 acres in the Cascade foothills in '55 with my VA benefits. I was 43 years old when I met your grandmother, Ruth. We married late, had your father, Jonathan, when I was 51. Ruth died when Jonathan was 10. Heart gave out, so I raised him alone. Your father was a good boy, Ethan, but he was soft. He didn't have the spine a man needs. When he grew up, he made bad decisions. He borrowed money from the wrong people. Victor Harlow was a loan shark who dressed like a businessman. Your father needed capital to open an auto repair shop, and the banks wouldn't touch him. Victor loaned him $50,000 at interest rates that would make a mobster blush, 400% annually. The debt compounded fast. When your parents died in that accident in '70, your father owed Victor $180,000. The debt transferred to me. I stopped reading again, my throat tight. The coffee had gone cold in my hand. Now the pieces were starting to fit together, and the picture they made was uglier than I'd imagined. Victor didn't want money, Ethan. He wanted the land. He'd gotten inside information, you see. Knew that the Bonneville Power Administration was planning a high-voltage transmission line through the area. Knew that land values would skyrocket. He'd been buying up parcels quietly, but he needed mine to complete the route. He came to see me 3 days after the funeral. You were still in the hospital, broken ribs and a concussion, but alive. He sat in my kitchen and told me how it would be. Sign over the land, or my grandson would have an accident, just like his parents did. I hit him. 65 years old, dying of cancer I didn't know I had yet, but I still had enough Marine in me to break his nose. He laughed, Ethan. Laughed with blood running down his face. You're going to die, old man. And when you do, I'll take the land. And I'll take the boy too, just to prove I can. That night I made the hardest decision of my life. The tears came then, hot and sudden, running down my face in the fluorescent glare of the Greyhound station. An old woman across the waiting area looked at me with concern, but I couldn't stop. 13 years of believing I'd been abandoned, and now this. I couldn't protect you with strength. The letter continued. I was old and sick, and Victor had money and connections and no conscience. So I protected you the only way I could. I made myself disappear from your life. I went to a lawyer, signed papers giving up my parental rights. Let the state take you. I made it look like I was abandoning you, like I didn't care, because that was the only way to make Victor believe you weren't worth his attention. If I didn't care about you, why would he bother using you against me? It destroyed me, Ethan. Every day for the next 6 years, until cancer finally took me, I thought about you. Wondered if you were safe, if you were healthy, if you hated me. I wrote you letters I never sent. I drove past the boys' home twice but never went in, because if Victor's people saw me there, the whole plan would fall apart. I died in '76. You were 12 years old. I never got to see you grow up, never got to teach you the things a grandfather should teach. But I left you something better than money or comfort. I left you a choice and the means to make it. The Quonset hut on the property isn't a storage shed. It's a fortress waiting to be built. In Korea, I lived in bunkers buried under 6 feet of earth. Bombs could fall, artillery could rain down, but inside those earthen shelters, we were safe. The temperature outside might be -35, but inside, with just body heat and a small stove, it stayed above freezing. I designed that hut using the same principles. It's large enough to live in. The steel frame is strong enough to support 100 tons of soil. If you cover it with earth, if you bury it under 3 feet of dirt and plant grass on top within a year, it will look like a natural hillside. No one will know you're there. The thermal mass of the earth will keep you warm in winter and cool in summer. With the well I drilled and the wood stove I installed, you can live off-grid indefinitely. You'll be invisible. And what they can't see, they can't take. In the footlocker beside the cot, you'll find my tools. The entrenching shovel I carried in Korea. My K-bar knife. A field manual. Well, I wrote myself everything I learned about survival in the worst conditions imaginable. You'll find seed packets, potatoes and beans and squash for when you're ready to grow food. And you'll find $6,500 in home, exactly enough to pay the back taxes with a little left over for supplies. You have 2 choices, Ethan. 1, sell the land to Marcus Harlow. Take his $85,000. Go to college, buy a car, live comfortably. No one would blame you. I won't blame you. You've earned an easy life. 2, fight, dig into that hill, move the mountain 1 shovelful at a time. Bury that hut until it becomes part of the landscape. Build the home I designed. Live on land that's been paid for with Ross blood land that no one can take from you if they can't find it. If you choose option 2, you need to understand what you're signing up for. It will be war, not with guns, but with shovels and sweat and will. You'll want to quit 100 times. You'll ask yourself why I left you this burden. The answer is simple. I want you to become a man, not a legal adult, which is just a number, but a real man. The kind who can move a mountain because he believes in something. The kind who can build a home with his own hands. The kind who stands firm when the whole world tells him to surrender. I learned in Korea that a man isn't measured by what he's given. He's measured by what he can endure, by what he can build from nothing, by how he stands when everything is taken away. If you complete this work, you'll have more than a house. You'll have yourself, the strongest version of yourself that you could ever become. I love you, Ethan. Every day I was alive, I thought about you. I'm sorry I couldn't be there as you grew up, but I'm not sorry for teaching you this final lesson. A man is measured by what he builds, not by what he says, not by what he owns, by what he creates with his own hands and leaves behind when he's gone. Semper Fidelis, always faithful. Your grandfather, Thomas Ross, United States Marine Corps, Korean War veteran. I sat in that bus station with the letter in my lap until dawn began to gray the windows. People came and went around me, living their lives, catching buses to destinations they'd chosen. I felt hollowed out, scraped clean, like every assumption I'd built my identity on had been peeled away. He hadn't abandoned me. He'd hidden me, protected me the only way he knew how at the cost of his own heart. I opened my duffel and pulled out the box again. The metals caught the early light. The key was heavy with promise and threat. The cash was real rubber banded into 50s and 100s. And beneath it all, the field manual written in Thomas's careful hand. Around 6 in the morning, I walked to the ticket counter. The clerk was a tired-looking woman with gray roots showing in her dark hair. "One way to Burton Creek," I said. She looked at me over her glasses. "That's pretty far out, honey." "You sure?" "I'm sure." $22. I counted out the bills, left with $1 and change in my pocket, and took my ticket to Platform 7. The bus wouldn't leave for 2 hours, so I sat on a bench outside watching Portland wake up under a sky the color of old pewter. In my pocket, my fingers found the dog tags I'd discovered at the bottom of Thomas's footlocker. I hadn't noticed them at first, wrapped as they were in an oilcloth, but there they were. Thomas Ross, USMC, O positive, Protestant. I slipped them over my head, felt their weight settle against my chest. Somewhere in the east, past the city and the suburbs and the farmland, 5 acres of Oregon forest waited. A steel shell waited to be transformed. A mountain of earth waited to be moved. And a choice waited to be made. Tyler, you asked me if I was scared. Of course I was scared. I was 19 years old, broke alone with nothing but a dead man's instructions and an impossible task ahead. Every rational part of my brain screamed at me to call Henderson, accept the money, disappear into a normal life. But sitting there on that bench, watching the sun try to break through the clouds, I realized something. I'd spent 13 years being invisible, being a case file, being a problem for the state to manage. I'd spent 13 years believing I was unwanted. Now I knew the truth. I was wanted so fiercely that a dying man had spent his last years planning my survival. I was loved so completely that my grandfather had broken his own heart to save mine. How could I dishonor that? How could I take the easy money and run when he'd left me a harder, better path? The bus rumbled into the station, diesel exhaust mixing with the morning air. I picked up my duffel bag and climbed aboard. Found a seat by the window. Watched the city begin to slide away. The Walkman in my pocket had died hours ago. Battery drained, but I could still hear Bruce Springsteen in my head. Born in the USA, born into a country that had sent my grandfather to freeze in Korean mountains. Born into a system that had raised me in institutional beige. Born into a world that thought land and money were the same thing. I would prove them wrong, not through words or protests or anger. Through work. Through transformation, through becoming the man Thomas believed I could be, the highway unreeled before us, carrying me toward mountains and forests, and a future I would build with my own hands. In my pocket, the key to a Quonset hut. In my heart, the weight of a soldier's sacrifice. In my muscles, untested and soft, the potential for change. When you can't run, you dig, Thomas had written. I was done running. I'd been running my whole life from grief and loss and abandonment. Now it was time to dig. The bus dropped me at a gravel pullout where Highway 26 intersected with an unnamed Forest Service road. The driver, a taciturn man with a thick beard and eyes that had seen too many forgotten places, pointed east into the trees. "Willow Ridge Road," he said. 4 miles that way. Hope you've got good boots." I looked down at my worn Converse sneakers and said nothing. The bus pulled away in a cloud of diesel smoke, and then there was only silence. The kind of silence that exists in places where humans are visitors, not residents. Wind moved through the crowns of Douglas firs that stretched 200 feet into the gray October sky. Somewhere distant, a raven called. I adjusted the duffel on my shoulder and started walking. The road was barely more than 2 ruts cut through the forest floor, overgrown with ferns and blackberry vines that caught at my jeans. The air smelled of damp earth and rotting leaves and the sharp green scent of conifer sap. Every 100 yards or so, I passed the skeletal remains of logging operations from decades past, rusted cables and abandoned equipment slowly being reclaimed by moss and vine. My sneakers, already worn thin, provided almost no protection from the sharp gravel. Within a mile, my feet ached. Within 2, I was fairly certain I had blisters forming. But I kept walking, because what else was there to do? Behind me lay the city, the offer of money, the easy escape. Ahead lay whatever Thomas had left me. The forest pressed in on both sides, dense and old growth, the kind of timber that had witnessed a century of seasons. Sword ferns grew waist-high in the understory. Nurse logs, fallen giants covered in bright green moss, served as cradles for new saplings. The ecosystem had a logic to it, a cycle of death and rebirth that felt both alien and strangely comforting. I thought about Thomas walking this same road in 1955, a young veteran with war medals and nightmares, looking for a place to build something permanent. Had he felt the same weight of the forest? Had he understood even then that this land would become a fortress for a grandson he wouldn't live to see? Grow up after 3 hours of walking, my legs trembling with exhaustion, the road opened into a clearing. And there it was. The Quonset hut sat in the approximate center of 5 acres, a massive arched skeleton of corrugated steel that glowed rust orange in the weak afternoon light. It was bigger than I'd imagined, maybe 40 feet long and 20 wide at the base, rising to a curved peak 15 feet high. The metal skin showed decades of weather mottled with corrosion and streaked with water stains. Blackberry vines had colonized the eastern side, climbing 15 feet up the curve, and wild grass grew tall around the perimeter. Behind the hut, maybe 50 yards back, rose a natural berm of earth, a small hill perhaps 20 feet high and 30 wide. The soil looked dense, rocky, studded with stones and roots. That was the mountain Thomas expected me to move, one shovel at a time. The clearing itself showed signs of old cultivation, the ghost of a garden plot long overgrown. A path worn to dirt leading from the hut to a hand pump well. A stack of firewood, gray with age, but still present testament to Thomas's final preparations before cancer took him. I approached the door, a flat panel of steel set into the front face of the hut. The lock was old and stiff. I had to put my shoulder into it to get the key to turn metal grinding against metal, and then the door swung inward with a shriek of protesting hinges. The smell hit me first. Cold air, stale and thick with the scent of rust and motor oil and mouse droppings. I stepped inside and my eyes adjusted slowly to the dimness. Light filtered through grimy plexiglass windows set high on the curved walls, illuminating a vast open space. The concrete floor was cracked and stained with oil and rust. Against the far wall stood a workbench, its surface cluttered with hand tools, coffee cans full of nuts, and bolts jars covered in cobwebs. A cast-iron wood stove squatted in one corner, its pipe rising to penetrate the ceiling. In the center of the space, draped in a dusty canvas tarp, hulked the shape of an old pickup truck. And in the back corner, almost lost in shadow, a simple wooden cot with a thin mattress. Beside it, a metal footlocker. This was my inheritance. This cold steel cave, this monument to isolation. This was what Thomas had left me instead of money or comfort, or any of the normal things grandfathers leave their grandchildren. I dropped my duffel on the concrete floor. The sound echoed in the cavernous space, swallowed by emptiness. And for the first time since reading the letter, the full weight of what I'd chosen crashed down on me. I sank to the floor, back against the cold metal wall, and let myself feel it. The grief for parents I barely remembered. The anger at 13 years of believing I was unwanted. The terror of being 19 and alone and responsible for an impossible task. The sheer crushing loneliness of this place. I cried until my throat was raw and my eyes burned, and there was nothing left inside me but hollow exhaustion. Darkness fell while I sat there. The temperature dropped and I began to shiver. Survival instinct finally kicked in. I forced myself to stand, to move, to do something other than despair. The firewood by the stove was dry, protected from weather by the hut's overhang. I found matches on the workbench, a book of them swollen with damp. It took a dozen attempts to get kindling lit, my cold fingers fumbling, but eventually a small flame caught. I fed it carefully, building it up, and slowly warmth began to bloom in that corner of the vast space. The well outside required frantic pumping, the handle stiff with disuse before water gushed out, rust-colored, and then slowly cleared. I drank until my teeth ached from the cold, the water tasting of stone and minerals and something ancient. As full darkness settled, I huddled by the stove, wrapped in the canvas tarp, feeding wood to the fire, listening to rain begin to drum on the metal roof. The sound was overwhelming, a continuous roar that filled the space. This was what weather sounded like when only a thin skin of corrugated steel separated you from it. In the firelight, my eyes fell on Thomas's letter, still in my duffel. I'd read it once in the bus station, but now I needed to read it again. The part about the footlocker, the part about what he'd left me beyond just the impossible task. I crossed to the corner and opened the metal lid. Inside, organized with military precision, I found his tools. Not just any tools, but the instruments of a soldier's trade. An entrenching shovel, the folding kind. Marines carried its blade worn smooth by use. A K-bar knife in a leather sheath, the 7-inch blade still sharp. Work gloves stiff with age. A hammer saw's wrenches levels, all carefully maintained and wrapped in oilcloth. Beneath the tools, canvas bags filled with seeds. Potatoes, beans, squash, each bag labeled in Thomas's careful handwriting and stamped with USMC. And at the bottom, wrapped in oilcloth and rubber bands, a thick stack of cash. I counted it with trembling fingers by firelight. $6,500 exactly, just as the letter promised. Enough to pay the taxes with maybe $800 to spare. But there was something else. Something Thomas hadn't mentioned in his letter, perhaps because it was too personal, too weighted with meaning. His dog tags. I pulled them from the oilcloth, the metal cold against my palm. Thomas Ross, USMC, O positive. Protestant. The stamped letters were worn but legible, the chain tarnished. These had hung around his neck in the frozen hell of Chosin Reservoir. These had survived what killed so many others. I slipped them over my head, felt their weight against my chest, and something shifted inside me. I wasn't just Ethan Ross, orphan, case number in a state system. I was Ethan Ross, grandson of a Marine inheritor of a legacy written in sacrifice and steel. Sleep came eventually, fitful and cold despite the fire. I woke multiple times to feed wood to the stove, to listen to the rain, to wonder what the hell I was doing here. Morning came gray and damp. My body ached from sleeping on the hard cot. My feet throbbed with blisters. My hands were soft and uncalloused, the hands of someone who'd spent his life indoors. I made weak coffee on the wood stove using grounds I found in the workbench and water from the well. Ate nothing because I had nothing to eat and no money to buy food until I paid the taxes. Then I stood in the doorway of the hut and looked at the hill of earth behind it. 20 feet high, maybe 30 feet across at the base. Dense soil studded with rocks and roots. That entire mass needed to move shovelful by shovelful to cover the curved walls and roof of this 40-foot-long structure. The math was brutal. Assume each shovelful was 1/10 of a cubic foot. Assume I could fill a wheelbarrow with 30 shovels. Assume I needed to cover the hut with 3 feet of soil all around. The total volume I needed to move was somewhere around 2,000 cubic feet. That meant 20,000 shovels. That meant 700 wheelbarrow loads. If I could manage 10 loads a day, it would take 70 days just to cover the walls, not counting the roof. And I'd never done this kind of labor in my life. I picked up the entrenching shovel, Thomas's shovel, and walked to the base of the hill. The first thrust into the earth felt wrong immediately. The angle was bad, the leverage poor. The shovel bit into the soil and stuck, requiring me to lever it free with my whole body. I managed to extract maybe 1/3 of a shovelful of dirt mixed with stones. By the time I'd filled one wheelbarrow, my hands were screaming. By the time I'd pushed that wheelbarrow to the side of the hut and dumped it, my back and shoulders burned with unfamiliar pain. I looked at the tiny pile of dirt against the massive steel wall and felt despair settle over me like a weight. This was impossible. Absolutely, utterly impossible. I lasted 2 hours that first day. 2 hours of digging, filling, pushing, dumping, repeating. 2 hours that produced maybe 4 wheelbarrow loads, a pathetic mound that didn't even reach the bottom lip of the hut's curve. I collapsed on the cot that afternoon, every muscle in my body throbbing. My hands had already raised blisters, despite the gloves. I couldn't grip anything without pain shooting through my palms. That night, I seriously considered calling Henderson, accepting the money, admitting defeat before I'd really begun. But I didn't have a phone, and I'd spent my last dollars on the bus ticket, and stupid pride, kept me from walking 4 miles back to the highway to give up. So I slept and woke and tried again. Day 3 was when everything changed. I was attempting my 6th wheelbarrow load of the morning sweat already soaking through my shirt, despite the October chill, when I heard the sound of an engine. A pickup truck, old and diesel, rumbling down the overgrown road. I straightened, shovel in hand, wary. Out here, visitors couldn't be casual. The truck was a Ford F-250 from the 70s, more rust than paint, but the engine sounded solid. It pulled into the clearing and stopped. The door opened and a man climbed out. He was maybe 60 tall and broad-shouldered with white hair and a thick beard going gray. He wore Carhartt work pants, a faded flannel shirt, and scuffed boots that had seen decades of labor. But it was his eyes that caught me, blue clear and measuring, the eyes of someone who'd seen things and survived them. Around his neck, visible above his shirt collar, hung dog tags. "I'm Carl," he said, his voice a rumble. "Carl Bennett. Live about 3 miles west. Saw smoke from your stovepipe yesterday. Figured I should check who's moved on to the old Ross place." "I'm Ethan Ross," I said. "Thomas's grandson." Carl stopped walking, stopped moving entirely for a moment. Then he looked at me with an intensity that made me want to step back. "Thomas's grandson," he repeated. "Christ, you look like him. Same eyes." You knew my grandfather. Carl's expression shifted into something complicated. Grief and respect and old pain all mixed together. "Yeah, I knew him." He paused. "Can we talk?" We sat on the tailgate of his truck, and Carl told me a story I hadn't known existed. 1975. Carl had come back from Vietnam with demons riding his shoulders. PTSD, though they didn't call it that then. They called it nothing, mostly just expected you to deal with it. He'd lost his squad in an ambush outside Da Nang, watched boys he'd trained with get torn apart by automatic weapons fire, came home to a wife who didn't recognize the man wearing her husband's face. She left him. He started drinking. By 75, he was drinking a fifth of whiskey a day and seriously contemplating eating his service pistol. One afternoon, his truck broke down on this very road. Alternator died, left him stranded. He was sitting on the bumper, drunk and desperate, when Thomas Ross drove by in that very pickup truck, still sitting in the hut. Thomas stopped, looked under the hood, fixed the alternator with wire and electrical tape, the kind of field repair you learn in the military. Then he said 4 words. "Follow me home, son." Carl followed. Thomas put him up in the Quonset hut for 3 months. Didn't ask about the war, didn't offer sympathy, didn't try to fix Carl with words. He just put tools in Carl's hands. Taught him to split wood, to repair engines, to work with his hands until the nightmares quieted. Before Thomas died in 76, Carl told me he made me promise something. He said one day his grandson would come here. Said the boy would need help like I'd needed help. Made me swear I wouldn't abandon him. Carl looked at me with those clear blue eyes. So I'm here, paying a debt to a dead man who saved my life. He slid off the tailgate and walked to my pathetic pile of excavated earth. Looked at my technique, at my blistered hands, at the mountain of dirt, still waiting. "You're doing it wrong," he said simply. "Killing yourself and accomplishing nothing." For the next hour, Carl taught me the fundamentals. How to stand to save my back. How to thrust the shovel at an angle that used leverage instead of pure strength. How to load a wheelbarrow so it balanced properly. How to pace myself so I could work for hours instead of minutes. Then he climbed back in his truck. I thought he was leaving. Instead, he lowered the tailgate and pulled out a piece of equipment covered in a tarp. A rototiller, old, rusty, but functional. "This was Thomas's," Carl said. "He bought it to break up the hill, but he got too sick to use it. It's yours now." "I can't pay you," I started to say. Carl held up a hand. "You don't pay for brotherhood. You pay it forward when your time comes." He showed me how to start the machine, how to guide it, and then he left. But before he drove away, he stopped at his truck window. "If anyone comes around asking about you, what should I tell them?" "Tell them I don't exist," I said. Carl nodded slowly. "Understood." He paused. There's trouble coming and isn't there? Yeah, I said. There is. Then work fast, son. And don't try to do it alone. The rototiller changed everything. What had taken me hours with a shovel took minutes with the machine. I could break up the hard-pan soil, the rocky clay, the root-bound earth that had defied the shovel. Within 3 days, my production tripled. 10 wheelbarrow loads became 30. But even with the machine, the work was brutal. I developed a routine born of necessity. Wake at first light, make coffee and eat whatever I could afford, usually oatmeal or beans. Work from 7 until noon, breaking only when my muscles screamed. Rest for an hour, eat again, work until dark. Then tend the fire, eat dinner, collapse into sleep so deep it felt like death. My body began to change. The softness of institutional life burned away, replaced by functional muscle. My hands calloused, my shoulders broadened. The boy who'd walked out of Northview Boys' Home was being forged into something harder. 4 weeks and the first letter arrived. A courier which was strange enough out here in the middle of nowhere. He handed me a thick envelope with a logo I recognized from Henderson's briefing. Harlow Enterprises. A stylized H in red. The letter was polite, professional, and absolutely threatening. Dear Mr. Ross, on behalf of the Harlow family, I wish to express condolences regarding your grandfather's passing. Thomas Ross was a stubborn man who made life difficult for many people, but I respected his tenacity. I understand you've inherited the property at Willow Ridge. My family has maintained a long-standing interest in this land due to an unpaid debt your father incurred. However, I don't wish to burden a young man just starting his life. I'm offering $85,000 cash for the property. This is more than generous considering the isolated location, lack of utilities, and substantial tax burden. The county assesses your property taxes at $4,800 annually. Without income or prospects, how will you maintain this land? Consider carefully, Ethan. My father gave your grandfather time. I'm giving you 60 days to accept this offer. The letter was signed Marcus Harlow in sharp, emotionless script. I used it to start the fire that night and watch the red H logo curl into ash. 2 weeks later, the phone call started. I'd bought a cheap prepaid cell phone at the hardware store in Burton Falls, a small town an hour away, where I'd gone to pay the property taxes. I needed it for emergencies, for staying in contact with the minimal world I still touched. I'd given the number to no one. Marcus Harlow called anyway. His voice was cultured, educated, the kind of voice that came from expensive schools and positions of power. He didn't threaten overtly. He was too smart for that. Instead, he applied pressure like a surgeon with a scalpel. Ethan, my father, is dying of liver cancer. In his final days, he speaks about this land, about your grandfather, about an old debt. I'd like to resolve this peacefully. I hung up. He called back 3 days later. You're working yourself to death out there. I've had people watching. You're trying to bury that Quonset hut, aren't you? Ambitious? Futile but ambitious. Why not take my money? Live comfortably. Let go of a dead man's dream. I hung up again. The third call came at night. I was in the hut, exhausted, the fire burning low. His voice had lost its polish. My father died yesterday. His last words were about you, about the Ross land. He made me promise, Ethan. Promise I wouldn't let you win. I'm sorry for your loss, I said carefully. No, you're not, and I'm not sorry for what's about to happen. 60 days is nearly up. If you don't sell, I'll take other measures, legal measures. I have lawyers who can find ways to seize that land. Do what you have to do, I said, and ended the call. But I was afraid. Marcus Harlow had resources I couldn't match. Money, lawyers, connections. All I had was a shovel and my grandfather's faith. The sabotage started in week 8. I woke one morning to find the well water clouded and foul-smelling. Chemical stink. I traced it to the spring that fed the well and found 2 empty containers of herbicide dumped near the source. The ground around them showed tire tracks from a vehicle that wasn't Carl's or mine. It took me 3 days to dig deeper, bypass the contaminated layer, and restore clean water. 3 days I couldn't spare. A week later, I woke at 2 in the morning to the smell of smoke. Stumbled outside to find a grass fire 50 yards from the hut, the dry October vegetation going up fast with wind blowing it toward my home. I fought that fire for 3 hours with a shovel and wet canvas, beating out flames until my lungs burned and my eyes streamed. When dawn came, I found evidence. An empty gas can, a lighter chrome plated with the initials MH engraved on the side. Marcus Harlow. Carl arrived that afternoon, saw the burn scar, and his expression went dark. He came back the next day with a shotgun, a Remington 12-gauge worn but well-maintained. This was Thomas's too, Carl said. He told me if things got bad, you'd need it. Not to shoot people, he said, just to make them think twice. Carl taught me to load it, to aim it, to respect it. I'm not a violent man, Ethan, but I learned in Vietnam that sometimes the only language predators understand is the threat of consequences. That night, Carl slept in his truck outside the hut, keeping watch. Nothing happened, but the message was clear. I wasn't completely alone. 3 months into the work, 85 days since I'd arrived, Marcus Harlow came in person. A black Mercedes sedan, absurdly out of place on the dirt road, pulled into the clearing. Two men got out. Marcus Harlow was 35, dressed in an expensive charcoal suit with Italian shoes already muddy from the walk from his car. Beside him stood a man who could only be muscle. Ray Kowalski, I'd learned later, former Portland cop fired for excessive force. 6'4", 250, with a scar running down his left cheek and a gun visible under his jacket. Marcus looked around and I saw confusion cross his face. The Quonset hut was disappearing. 70% of the walls were buried under earth. I'd built a ramped approach to the roof and begun covering the top. From certain angles, it already looked like part of the landscape. "What are you doing?" Marcus asked, genuinely puzzled. "Building a home." "By burying it," he laughed sharp and ugly. "This is insane. You're insane." I stood there 20 years old now. My birthday having passed without notice, holding an axe I'd been using to split firewood. Shirtless despite the November cold because I'd been working hard. My body was no longer that of the soft, institutional boy. I'd put on 20 pounds of muscle, my shoulders and back corded with new strength. Marcus opened a briefcase, pulled out a checkbook. "Final offer, 50,000. That's as low as I'll go." "No." His face darkened. "You don't understand the situation. I have lawyers. I can prove your father's debt. I can seize this land through legal channels." "You don't have proof," I said, calmly. "There's no contract, no documentation. Just your father's word against a dead man's memory." Marcus's hand clenched on the briefcase. His associate Ray shifted his stance, hand moving toward his gun. And that's when Carl stepped out of the tree-lined shotgun cradled in his arms, not quite pointing at anyone, but definitely present. "Hands off the weapon," Carl said quietly. Marcus spun. "Carl Bennett, I've heard about you. Drunk veteran playing bodyguard." "Sober veteran," Carl corrected. "And I still remember how to shoot." For 10 seconds, nobody moved. The forest held its breath. I could hear my own heartbeat. Finally, Marcus smiled, cold and vicious. "You win today. But war isn't a single battle. I'll find your weakness, Ethan. Everyone has one. And when I find yours, I'll use it." He got back in his Mercedes and drove away, Ray Kowalski following, both men radiating frustrated violence. Carl lowered the shotgun and I saw his hands trembling slightly. "Haven't pointed a weapon at a man since '69. Almost pulled the trigger." "Thank you," I said. "Don't thank me. I'm just keeping a promise to Thomas." He looked at the partially buried hut, at the mountain of work still ahead. "But Marcus is right about one thing. He'll be back. And next time he'll be smarter. Then I'd better work faster." December brought the first snow. Light at first, just a dusting that melted by noon. But the ground was freezing now, the earth turning hard as concrete. The rototiller became almost useless. I was back to the pickaxe and shovel, breaking frozen soil one strike at a time. My production dropped to a quarter of what it had been. Some days I managed only 5 wheelbarrow loads. The math was brutal. At this rate, I wouldn't finish before spring, and I didn't know if I could survive the winter. Carl helped when he could, but he had his own land to maintain. Twice he brought friends. Don, a Navy veteran who'd been a welder. Mike, an Army vet who'd worked construction. They spent weekends helping me reinforce the steel frame of the hut welding supports that would bear the weight of the earth above. We didn't talk much while we worked. Didn't need to. There's a language veterans speak that transcends words, a understanding born from shared service. They were helping me because Carl had asked, and Carl had asked because Thomas had saved him, and Thomas had saved him because that's what you do for brothers. "Pay it forward," Don said one night as we sat around a fire outside the hut drinking beer. "That's the code. You help who you can, when you can, because someone helped you once." By January, I was living in a half-buried cave. The walls were covered, the roof was 70% buried, and I'd begun laying salt over the exposed earth. From the road, you could barely tell there was a structure here anymore. Just a natural rise in the landscape with a small south-facing opening. Inside, the temperature had stabilized. The thermal mass of the earth kept it around 50 degrees, regardless of outside conditions. The wood stove could raise it to 65 with minimal fuel. I was living like a badger in a burrow, but I was warm and safe. The garden plot I'd cleared in November lay frozen, waiting for spring. I'd planted nothing yet, but the seed packets sat ready, Thomas's last gift to his future. I thought about those seeds constantly during the darkest parts of winter. Potatoes that would become food, beans that would sustain me, squash that would ripen in the fall. They were more than seeds. They were Thomas's belief that I would survive long enough to plant them, to tend them, to harvest them. They were faith made tangible. One night in late January, when the temperature dropped below zero, and I was burning through firewood faster than I'd planned, when my food supplies had dwindled to almost nothing, and Marcus Harlow's final offer of money sounded almost reasonable, I sat by the stove and pulled out those seed packets, held them in my calloused hands, felt their weight light as hope. Thomas hadn't just left me instructions for survival. He'd left me instructions for life, for growth, for a future beyond mere endurance. And in that moment, I understood. This wasn't about defying Marcus Harlow. It wasn't about proving I was tough enough or stubborn enough. It was about transformation, about planting myself in this soil and seeing what grew. The next morning, I went back to work despite the cold, despite the exhaustion, despite every rational reason to quit. Because I wasn't just building a house anymore. I was building the man I wanted to become. Spring came to the Cascades like a whispered promise, tentative at first, then undeniable. The snow retreated up the mountainsides. Ice melted from the well pump. The earth, which had been concrete hard for 3 months, softened into workable soil again. And on the first day of March 1984, I placed the final wheelbarrow load of earth on the roof of what had been a Quonset hut and was now something else entirely. I stood on top of my home, on top of the mountain I'd moved one shovel at a time, and looked out across 5 acres of Oregon forest that belonged to me. Not because someone had given it to me, because I'd earned it with 5 months of labor that had rebuilt my body and reforged my soul. The structure beneath my feet was invisible now. From the road, from any angle except straight on, you couldn't tell there was a building here. Just a gentle rise in the landscape, a grassy hill that looked like it had been there forever. Only the south-facing entrance gave it away, a small doorway, and 2 windows set into what appeared to be a natural earthen bank. Carl stood at the base of the hill, looking up at me. Thomas would be proud, he called. I knelt and pressed my palm flat against the earth, feeling the solid mass of it, the weight I'd moved and shaped and transformed. Ong Noi I whispered in Vietnamese, a language I'd never spoken, but which felt right in that moment I did it. I moved the mountain. The wind carried my words away into the trees. But moving the mountain was only half the battle. Now came the part Thomas had believed in even more than the construction, the growing. I spent the next 6 weeks cutting sod from the wild meadow that bordered the property. Using a borrowed sod cutter, I harvested 2-foot by 2-foot sections of native grass roots in soil intact and carried them piece by piece up to the roof. I laid them like puzzle pieces, fitting them together, creating a living blanket that would bind the soil and complete the camouflage. I watered them daily with buckets hauled from the well, watched them brown and wilt in the first week, certain I'd killed them. Then watched with something like waning awe as they recovered, sent out new roots, began to knit together into a continuous green carpet. By mid-April, you couldn't see the seams anymore. The roof was a meadow. Wildflowers volunteered themselves, emerging from seed bank in the soil I'd used. Dandelions, clover, wild strawberry yarrow. Birds landed on it, pecked for insects, had no idea they were standing on a human dwelling. The garden plot I'd cleared in the fall was ready for planting. I broke Thomas's seed packets open with reverent hands. Seed potatoes wrinkled and sprouting. Bean seeds hard as pebbles. Squash seeds flat and white. Carl came to help me plant. Showed me the old ways, the methods his father had taught him and his father before that. How to hill potatoes so they had room to grow. How to create bean poles from saplings. How to give squash enough space to sprawl. We worked in silence, mostly 2 men putting faith in the earth, trusting that these small, hard things would become food. When we finished, the garden looked like nothing. just disturbed soil in neat rows. Give it time, Carl said. Life wants to happen. You just have to give it room. 3 weeks later, the first green shoots pushed through the soil. I knelt beside them, touched the tender leaves with fingers that had become permanently stained with dirt, and felt something break open in my chest. I was growing food, creating life, participating in the ancient contract between human and earth that had sustained our species for 10,000 years. Thomas had known that this would mean more to me than mere survival. That watching something grow because I'd planted it, tended it, believed in it would heal parts of me I didn't know were broken. That night, I wrote in the journal I'd started keeping. Potato plants 2 inches tall, beans germinating, squash still underground, but I can feel them coming. I'm not just surviving here, I'm living. May brought new complications. A sheriff's deputy drove up the overgrown road one afternoon, looked confused when he couldn't find a building, then spotted me working in the garden. He was maybe 50, weathered with kind eyes that had seen too much human tragedy. Ethan Ross, that's me. He handed me an envelope. Court summons. You've been sued. I wiped dirt from my hands and opened it. The language was dense legal prose, but the meaning was clear. Marcus Harlow versus Ethan Ross. Claim of unpaid debt plus unlawful retention of collateral property. Demanding either $200,000 in compensation or forfeiture of the land. Court date set for June 15th. The deputy watched me read sympathy in his expression. Between you and me, Marcus Harlow is a piece of work. But he's got 3 expensive lawyers from Portland. You need representation. I don't have money for lawyers. Then you're in trouble, son. He started to leave, then turned back. You know Carl Bennett? He's a friend. Carl's good people. Ask him for help. He knows people. That night, Carl made a phone call. To Diana Wright, he told me. Daughter of my platoon leader in Vietnam. Her father saved my life at Khe Sanh, took a bullet meant for me. Died 3 days later from infection. Diana practices law in Portland now. Land rights mostly. She does pro bono work for veterans and their families. I'm not a veteran, no, Carl said, but you're the grandson of one, and you're under my protection. That makes you family. Diana Wright arrived 2 days later in a sensible Honda Accord that handled the rough road better than Marcus's Mercedes ever had. She was 42, whip smart with short dark hair and glasses that made her look professorial. She wore hiking boots under her suit pants and carried a briefcase that had seen hard use. She surveyed the property with professional interest, noting the garden, the well, the invisible house built into the hillside. Walked up to the grassy roof and stood there looking out over the forest. Clever, she said. Legal getting there, I replied. We sat in my underground home and I told her everything. Thomas's letter, the Korean War, the debt that wasn't really a debt, Victor Harlow's threats, Marcus's escalating pressure, the sabotage, the confrontation. Diana took notes in a leather-bound journal asking sharp questions, her legal mind dissecting the situation into components she could work with. After 2 hours, she sat back. Okay, here's what we know. First, the debt claim is garbage. There's no contract, no notarized agreement, nothing that would hold up in court. Statute of limitations has run out anyway. They're bluffing. Why sue then? Because Marcus is desperate. She pulled out a folder. I did some research, spent 2 weeks in county records, made some calls to contacts at the Bonneville Power Administration. She laid out documents on my small table. See this? BPAA is planning a 500 kilovolt transmission line through this region. High tension power east to west feeding the grid. The route goes right through here. She pointed to a map. They'll pay landowners for easement rights. Not to buy the land, just for permission to run power lines across it. How much? $800 to $1,200 per acre annually. For 50 years. Your 5 acres. That's $4,000 to $6,000 a year. Times 50. That's $250,000 in easement fees. My God. Marcus has been buying up land in this corridor for the past 3 years. Bought cheap used inside information from a BP, a committee member he'd bribed. I have emails proving it from a whistleblower who contacted me. If Marcus controls the whole corridor, he stands to make $5 to $6 million. But he doesn't control it, I said slowly, because he doesn't have my 5 acres. Exactly. You're the missing piece. Without your land, the corridor isn't complete. BPA can root around you, but it'll cost them time and money. Marcus borrowed heavily to buy the surrounding parcels. If this deal falls through, he's facing bankruptcy. So this isn't about an old debt. It's about desperation. Diana smiled. Now you understand. And desperate men make mistakes. She laid out her strategy. We don't just defend against his lawsuit. We go on offense. We sue him for harassment, attempted theft, arson poisoning your water supply. We threaten to leak the corruption scandal to the media and the FBI. We make settling with you the least painful option available to him. Can we win? We already have. He just doesn't know it yet. But winning in court wasn't the same as being left alone. Marcus Harlow was the kind of man who didn't accept defeat gracefully. The call came 3 days before the scheduled court date. Diana answered her office phone and put it on speaker. Marcus Harlow's voice strained and raw. I'm prepared to settle. Drop the lawsuit in exchange for Ethan selling the land. Final offer, $150,000. No, Diana said calmly. $200,000. Kish. No. There was silence on the line. Then Marcus's voice quieter, almost pleading. You don't understand. I'm about to lose everything. Then you should have made better choices, Diana replied and hung up. On June 10th, 5 days before the court date, Marcus Harlow came to the property himself. He came alone this time. No Ray Kowalski, no muscle. Just a man in his mid-30s who looked like he'd aged 10 years and 6 months. His suit was rumpled, his face unshaven, his eyes red-rimmed with exhaustion, or tears, or both. His Mercedes was dusty, the expensive paint scratched by branches. He parked and got out, looking around with the expression of someone lost in unfamiliar territory. I was working near the garden transplanting tomato seedlings Carl had started for me. I stood slowly waiting. Marcus walked closer, his polished shoes sinking into soft earth. He looked around confused. Where's the house? I saw it before, the metal building. I pointed at the grassy hill behind me. He stared. You buried it? You actually buried it. I built it, the way my grandfather designed it. Marcus walked up to the hill, right up to where the grass grew thick and green, until he was standing a foot from the hidden door. His hand reached out, touched the earth wall, the living roof. From his angle, it just looked like landscape. I can't even see it, he whispered. I'm standing right here, and I can't see it. That was the idea. He turned to face me, and I saw something break in his expression. The arrogance was gone. The threat was gone. What remained was just a man who'd gambled everything and lost. Ethan, I need you to understand something. My father was a criminal. I know that. He did terrible things. But he was also dying, and his last words to me, his last request, was that I not let Thomas Ross's family win. I'm sorry for your loss, I said carefully. But that's not my problem. I know. Marcus's voice cracked. I know it's not. But I'm asking anyway. I'm begging. $200,000, everything I have left. Please, I thought about it. Genuinely considered it. $200,000 was more money than I'd ever dreamed of having. It could change everything, but I looked at the garden growing behind me, green and alive. Looked at the invisible house built into the hillside, camouflaged by the earth I'd moved with my own hands. Looked at my calloused palms, my scarred knuckles, my body that had been transformed by 5 months of impossible labor. My grandfather wrote me a letter, I said quietly. He told me a man is measured by what he builds, not by what he takes. What have you built, Marcus? Besides an empire of lies, Marcus's face went white. You're going to regret this. No, I said. You're the one who's going to regret it. You spent 3 years chasing easy money. I spent 6 months building a life. We both made our choices. Marcus stared at me for a long moment, then walked back to his car. Drove away without another word. 2 weeks later, the Portland Tribune ran a front-page story. Harlow Enterprises declares bankruptcy. Local businessman faces federal bribery charges. There was a photo of Marcus being led into the federal courthouse in handcuffs, his expensive suit looking cheap in the harsh camera flash. Diana called me that evening. It's over. The FBI investigation found enough evidence to indict him on 5 counts. He'll likely take a plea deal, serve 2 to 3 years minimum. And he's financially destroyed. Had to sell everything just to pay his lawyers. I didn't feel triumphant, just tired and relieved. Thank you, I told Diana, for everything. Thank Carl, and thank Thomas. Men like that, they create ripples that last generations. Summer arrived in full force. My garden exploded with growth. Potato plants flowered, promising tubers below ground. Bean vines climbed their poles, producing pods faster than I could pick them. Squash sprawled across the plot leaves the size of dinner plates shading the soil. Carl had helped me build a small chicken coop in May. I bought 6 hens from a local farmer, and by July they were producing more eggs than I could eat. I traded the surplus at the farmer's market in Burton Falls for other supplies. Flour salt coffee, things I couldn't produce myself. The woman who ran the organic vegetable stand noticed the quality of my produce, asked where I was growing it. Up in the hills, I said vaguely. Old family land. She introduced herself as Sarah. Late 20s with sun-streaked brown hair and freckles across her nose, and the kind of smile that made you want to smile back. She taught second grade during the school year and farmed in the summer. We started talking. Every Saturday, I'd drive Thomas's old pickup truck, which I'd gotten running with Carl's help, down to Burton Falls. I'd sell eggs and vegetables at one end of the market while Sarah sold hers at the other, and we'd meet for coffee when the crowds thinned. She asked about my life. I told her a carefully edited version. The full truth felt too heavy to share with someone I was just getting to know. But in August, I invited her to see the property. She drove up in a Subaru wagon filled with gardening tools and supplies, pulled into the clearing, and looked around in confusion. "Where's your house?" I pointed at the hill. Sarah climbed out, walked over, examined the grassy slope, the wildflowers growing thick the way it blended seamlessly into the landscape. Then she found the door hidden in shadow, and her eyes went wide. "You live underground, not underground. Earth sheltered." I opened the door, showed her inside. The interior had evolved over the months. I'd built furniture from salvaged lumber. Installed the solar panels Carl had helped me mount hidden among the grass on the south slope of the roof. Set up a small kitchen area, a reading nook with books from the library, a workshop where I built and repaired things. It was small, maybe 400 square feet of living space, but it was clean, organized, and unmistakably lived in. Sarah walked through it slowly, touching the earthen walls, the hand-hewn beams, the wood stove that had kept me alive through winter. "You built all this yourself with help from friends?" But yes, she turned to face me, and her expression had changed. "This is the most remarkable thing I've ever seen." We sat outside by the garden as the sun set, and I told her the real story. All of it. Thomas and Kriya, and the sacrifice he'd made to protect a grandson he'd never see grow up. The choice I'd faced. The mountain I'd moved. The war with Marcus Harlow, and the victory that had cost me everything I owned but given me everything that mattered. Sarah listened without interrupting. When I finished, darkness had fallen and stars blazed overhead in a sky unpolluted by city lights. "Your grandfather was right," she said quietly. "You did become a man." "I'm still becoming," I replied. "That's what being a man means. It's not a destination. It's a direction you keep choosing." She came back the next weekend and the next. By September, she was spending more time on the property than at her apartment in Burton Falls. By October, she'd moved her things into the Earth House, and we were building a life together in that invisible home. Carl's health began to fail in the winter of 1985. His heart, the doctor said, weakened by age and stress, and the weight of memories carried too long. He'd helped me plant a second garden that spring, helped me add solar capacity, helped me dig a root cellar for storing the harvest. In December, I visited him in the hospital. He was thin, diminished, but his eyes were still clear. "Done good, kid," he said, his voice weak. "Thomas would be proud." "Hell, I'm proud. You saved my life," I told him. "Just like Thomas saved yours." "That's the chain," Carl replied. "That's how it works. Somebody saves you, you save somebody else. One day you'll do the same. Promise me." "I promise." Carl died on January 3rd, 1986. I spoke at his funeral, a small service attended mostly by other veterans. I talked about debt and honor, and the way one man's kindness can echo through generations. I wore Thomas's dog tags that day, felt their weight against my chest like a reminder of the chain Carl had described. Thomas to Carl, to me, and someday, God willing, from me to someone else. Now I'm 60 years old, Tyler. I sit here by this fire with you, my 19-year-old grandson, and I see myself 4 decades ago. I see the questions in your eyes, the uncertainty about who you are and who you might become, the weight of the world pressing down on your shoulders. You asked why I live here, why I never left this hidden house, this invisible home. The answer is complicated and simple at the same time. Sarah and I married in 1990. We had 2 children. Your father James born in 92 and your Aunt Emma born in 95. James never understood this life. He wanted cities and careers and all the things the modern world promised. He moved to Seattle, became a software engineer, married your mother. They gave you everything money could buy. But Emma understood. She stayed. Built her own earth house on the eastern edge of the property. Lives here still raising her own children in dirt and starlight and the knowledge that home isn't something you buy. It's something you build. This land has been in our family for 70 years now. Registered as the Ross Family Nature Preserve, protected from development, passed down through generations. From the road you can't see the houses, can't tell that people live here. We're invisible, hidden in plain sight, exactly as Thomas designed. I've had offers over the years. Developers, speculators, people who found out about the BP, easement, and thought they could pressure an old man into selling. I turned them all down, because this isn't about money. It never was. It's about legacy, about the chain of honor that connects us to those who came before and those who will come after. About understanding that worth isn't measured in dollars, but in what you create with your own hands and pass on to your children. I reach into my pocket and pull out the dog tags. Thomas Ross, USMC. They're tarnished now, 74 years old, but the stamped letters are still legible. I hold them out to Tyler. He takes them carefully, reverently, feeling their weight. These belong to your great-great-grandfather. He wore them in the frozen hell of Korea. They survived when so many didn't. He gave them to me through Carl, and now I'm giving them to you. Tyler's voice breaks when he speaks. I don't know if I'm worthy of this. Nobody is worthy at the start. Thomas wasn't worthy when he landed in Korea at 23. Carl wasn't worthy when he came back from Vietnam, broken and suicidal. I wasn't worthy when I stood in front of that mountain of earth at 19. We became worthy through what we did, through the choices we made when it would have been easier to quit. You'll face your own mountains someday, Tyler. Maybe not a literal one, but something that seems impossible, something that demands everything you have and more. When that day comes, remember this story. Remember that your great-great-grandfather moved earth in Korea to survive, that I moved earth here to build a life. That worthiness isn't inherited, it's earned. The fire has burned down to coals. The night is deep around us, the forest alive with small sounds. Somewhere an owl calls hunting. The wind moves through the pines with a sound like breathing. Tyler slips the dog tags over his head. They settle against his chest, and I see something shift in his posture. A straightening, an acceptance of weight and responsibility and legacy. Grandpa, he says quietly, thank you for telling me this. Thank you for listening. Not many people your age would sit still for an old man's war stories. They're not war stories, they're survival stories. They're about what it means to be a man. Same thing, I reply. We sit in companionable silence as the stars wheel overhead. Behind us, invisible in the darkness, the earth house breathes. Warm air rises from the chimney pipe, hardly visible. The garden sleeps under mulch, waiting for spring. The land endures patient and eternal. Tomorrow, Tyler will go back to the city, back to college and career, and all the demands of modern life. But he'll carry something with you now. The knowledge that he comes from a line of men who didn't run when things got hard, who dug in, who built with their hands, who stood firm, and maybe, just maybe, when his own mountain appears, he'll remember. He'll feel the weight of those dog tags against his chest and know what it means to be a Ross. Not wealth or status, or any of the things the world says matter, but the quiet pride of looking at something you built and knowing it will outlast you. Knowing you created it not because it was easy, but because it was necessary. Knowing you became the man you needed to be by doing the work no one else could do. That's the inheritance I'm leaving him. Not money or land, though he'll have those too, eventually, but something more valuable. The knowledge that he carries the strength of Marines in his blood, that he comes from men who survived the unsurvivable and built the unbuildable, that when the world says quit, men like us say dig. The fire dies to ash, the night grows cold. But we sit here a while longer, grandfather and grandson linked by metal and memory, and the unbreakable chain of honor that connects us to a soldier who froze in Korea 74 years ago and never gave up. I think Thomas would approve, would see in Tyler the same potential he saw in me when he wrote that letter in 1976, dying but determined to leave behind more than regret. The Earth House will stand for generations. Hidden, protected, home to those who understand that true wealth isn't what you own, but what you build, what you pass on, what you become. And somewhere in the soil beneath our feet, in the roots of grass, in the slow, patient work of earthworms, in the endless cycle of growth and decay and rebirth, the land remembers. Remembers Thomas. Remembers me. Will remember Tyler when his time comes. That's what it means to dig in, to become part of the earth itself, to build something so true and so right that it transcends the builder and becomes eternal. The stars shine down on an old man and a young one on 5 acres of Oregon forest that hold 3 generations of houses hidden in plain sight on a legacy written in sweat and soil and the quiet, stubborn refusal to surrender. This is my answer, Tyler. This is why I live here. Because home isn't where you were born or where you were raised. Home is what you build when the world offers you nothing but a key and a choice and the faith that you might be strong enough to earn it. I built this. It built me. And now I'm passing it to you. The chain continues. The work endures. The earth shelters those who honor it. And that grandson is what it means to be free.